Welcome to Conversations on Healthcare. I'm Mark Masselli.
And I'm Margaret Flinter.
Well, Margaret, it's been a dramatic week of breaking health news. The Omicron variant has been discovered in this country, as well as in dozens of countries around the world, just weeks after it was first discovered and sequenced in South Africa.
It feels a little bit like deja vu all over again, as we went through earlier with the Delta variant. And as we have seen before, this pathogen is really proving to be problematic. We thought we got into a place with some degree of containment. The virus strikes again in a new way, or in this case, a whole new variant.
Well, Margaret, we've heard from so many experts we've had on this show this year predicted that this would happen. Fundamentally, until the whole world is vaccinated, this will be a recurring theme. There's much we don't know about Omicron, and what we do know is concerning. And still, we're waiting for more facts to come in, but more than 50 mutations on a spike protein means that it may evade immunity. And early data shows it's 6 times more contagious than the Delta variant. So it's highly transmissible. The question yet to be determined is it more lethal? It's just too soon to have a definitive answer on that.
You know, Mark, I don't know about you, but I think so many people now actually have this image of what's a coronavirus, what are these spike proteins, and can imagine what those mutations might mean for us. But the latest data that I'm seeing out of Africa and Israel seems to provide some perhaps good news that our vaccines currently in use do provide protection against serious illness from the new variant, but still too early to know. So much we don't know, and of course, hitting at a really rough period of time in the year for this to be emerging.
No, absolutely. There's no good time, but certainly around the holidays, this is having a big impact on people. And it's no surprise that the president was out front immediately talking about some changes to travel policy and really call for strict public health protocols, really perhaps for the foreseeable future until we really gain more knowledge on this, including widespread masking in public. And the president is urging all unvaccinated Americans to get the vaccine, now more urgent than ever. And we've really, on this show, really tried to reach out to people. And, the best person you can go to is your primary care provider or somebody you trust to really talk about the questions that you have on mind. But, we want to make sure that all adults 18 and older get the booster who've been fully vaccinated or who've gotten the first 2 doses, or in the case of J&J, gotten 1, get that booster in there. And there's some really good data on the dramatic improvement in immunity from the 3rd shot, Margaret, as well.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Very glad got my booster. I think you probably do too. But You know what I was thinking about as I read the news about the Biden administration and their new approach to testing is I'm hearing now what experts started telling us, 6 months ago, we should have been doing back at the very beginning. And that is really making testing much more available to people, including to do self-testing at home. And so the Biden administration news that they're going to make rapid at-home tests available for free to insured Americans. I assume that means the insurers are paying for it. But they're also going to make sure that people who are uninsured and other vulnerable populations are able to easily get rapid tests for free at community centers around the country. That's certainly happening in our own organization. And this so gets at that heart of make testing free, accessible, and widely available if you really want to know what is going on with the emergence of the variant and with the pandemic. I think this might be a game changer in how this next phase plays out as opposed to some of our earlier phases. I'm really so pleased to hear this.
One thing that I don't think I had an eye on was that they are now making available reimbursement to providers just to have the consultation with somebody about the vaccine. It was kind of interesting. We've been telling everybody to go to their doctor, and people who are cost conscious are probably thinking, well, that's going to cost me something. But in fact, just to get that question answered, it looks like the Biden administration is really trying to develop a model that will allow people to talk with that primary care provider who we know is very trusted. But we'll keep an eye on these latest developments. The COVID story is obviously far from over, but there was another dramatic piece of breaking news this week impacting women's health. Margaret, the Supreme Court heard arguments on the Mississippi law banning all abortions after 15 weeks.
Yeah. Well, this one has certainly had us riveted to the news shows as we watch this unfold. This is the most dramatic threat to Roe versus Wade in almost 50 years, Mark. The right to safe and legal abortion hanging in the balance in many parts of the country right now. Those of us in healthcare are very concerned about what the impact of this will be on women, on women's health, and I will say on women's lives. It places an enormous burden on women's reproductive rights if the Supreme Court upholds the Mississippi law. And I think for many of us, we just find it hard to believe we're here in this place.
No, absolutely. And the conversation or the dialogue by the justices were quite dramatic. Certainly, Justice Sotomayor very concerned that this might be overturned. And certainly the decision is a ways away, isn't expected for months, but it's pretty wide held belief that they're looking at some dramatic change to Roe versus Wade moving forward. We'll certainly keep an eye on it.
And on the heels of the Supreme Court hearing this week, we thought it would be good to revisit a pretty recent interview with Planned Parenthood President Alexis McGill Johnson. On that show, Mark, she really outlined for us in great detail what's at stake and has some very powerful observations on what this could mean for women's reproductive health care. And again, I will say for women's health and women's lives. So here's our recent interview with Alexis McGill Johnson on Conversations on Healthcare.
Welcome to Conversations on Healthcare with Mark Masselli and Margaret Flinter. This week we welcome Alexis McGill Johnson, President and CEO of the Planned Parenthood Federation of America, on ongoing challenges to Roe v. Wade. Now, here's Mark Masselli and Margaret Flinter.
We're speaking today with Alexis McGill Johnson, President and CEO of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, now in its centennial year, and Planned Parenthood Action Fund.
A seasoned activist and organizer, she serves on the boards of Color of Change and the Leadership Council for Civil and Human Rights. Alexis, welcome to Conversations on Healthcare.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to be here.
Well, Alexis, we're approaching the 50th anniversary of Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court decision which legalized abortion. But never since that time have American reproductive rights seemed so in peril. And we can simply start with the most recent Texas law, SB 8, banning all of abortions after 6 weeks. And the law allows average citizens uniquely to sue anyone connected to such abortions. And late last week, the Supreme Court stated its intent to uphold certain aspects of SB 8 on November 1st. Can you bring our listeners up to speed on the intent of the law and the latest developments around it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you're right. Last week, the Supreme Court granted both our and the Biden administration's requests to hear the challenges to SB 8 on November 1st, and that is significant. We were looking forward to our patients and providers finally having their day in court, but they have allowed this law, as you have named, not just unusual, but particularly cruel, to remain in effect despite the devastating harm that we have already seen. SB 8 is a 6-week blatantly unconstitutional ban against abortion. Normally, when you have an unconstitutional law, you are able to appeal this law, sue the state lawmakers who put it into place. Instead, what Texas has done is created a provision where the state actually cannot enforce the law that they created, and instead empowers average citizens in any state, even outside of Texas, to enforce the law with what's been called a bounty hunting provision. That if they find out that someone has had an abortion after 6 weeks in Texas, anyone who has helped them secure that access to abortion can be charged with a $10,000 fine. So it is incentivized in the most perverse way behavior that pits citizens against citizens, neighbors against neighbors, and has in effect stopped the provision of abortion care after 6 weeks, sending thousands of people seeking access to care outside of Texas into neighboring states, all the way up to where I am in the Northeast. So it's abominable.
Well, Alexis, I have to say, it's almost just shocking hearing you say it out loud, even though we've been hearing this and reading this. But while these legal questions play out around SB 8, Texas is not alone, right? And according to the Guttmacher Institute, more than 100 laws restricting abortions have passed in states all around the country this past year. So it's not just Texas, though we've got our eyes so closely on Texas. Help us understand the full impact these laws are having on impeding access to reproductive health services across the country. And we understand also maybe there's a diminishing in the number of the clinicians prepared to provide such services that have resulted from this as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, look, we know that what's happening in Texas is not going to stay in Texas. As many as 12 states are already threatening to pass copycat bills thus far. We know a bill has been pre-filed in Florida. Politicians in Arkansas are also threatening the same. And I think the lawmakers have been very clear, right? In their, we've had Governor, Hutchinson, Arkansas, sending a clear note to the Supreme Court that they wanted the court to consider overturning Roe in this process. So abortion is consistently under attack, right? As you mentioned, 100 restrictions in 2021 alone, the most restrictions on record since Roe was decided in 1973. These onerous barriers, what are called trap laws, targeted regulations specifically of abortion providers, have made it increasingly difficult for providers to provide care for their patients and in their communities. And we also know that these laws have very little to do with protecting patient safety, everything to do with shutting down health centers by subjecting providers to unnecessary restrictions. And that means that far too many people, that the right to access abortion is a right in name only. Part of the tactic that undergirds these bans is not just to shame the person seeking access to abortion care, but also the people around them who are doing that. And I think that's what we are seeing, not just in Texas, but in the neighboring states that are also poised to enact similar bans.
Alexis, I want to pull the thread on your statement about the impact this is having on women's health. And at last check, hundreds of Texas women have been forced to cross state lines to gain access to abortion. And I think everybody knows Texas is a very large state. It's not Rhode Island, where it's perhaps a simple drive, not that it should happen in any state. But this is very difficult, and women can't necessarily afford the time to travel with all the responsibilities that they have. It's really become a serious impediment to clinicians practicing in Texas and causing strains, I would imagine, in all the bordering states, as you just mentioned, all the way up to the Northeast. Women are seeking assistance. Tell us a little more about what you're seeing on the ground. Paint a picture for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you can imagine, right, in rendering the right to access abortion is effectively meaningless in the state. We're talking, 6 weeks is the terminology, but we're really talking about 2 weeks after this period. So the logistical nightmare that patients are going through on top of what Texas already had in place. They had a 24-hour mandatory waiting period, mandatory ultrasound and counseling. And so the whole process of getting an appointment, not just one appointment, but 2 appointments prior to the cardiac activity that they are allegedly legislating the abortion against, means that it is not just a logistical challenge. It is an emotional challenge for those who need access to care. During the month of September, Planned Parenthood health centers in surrounding surrounding states saw 1,000% increase in patients in Texas. Okay, more Texans were being seen in Oklahoma than Oklahomans. And that means that people are being forced significant travel distances outside of state for access to abortion. Some of these other states have their own restrictions, right? So it means we had one patient who traveled twice to Mississippi from Texas to get abortion at Jackson Women's Health Organization. And they're also facing, different mandatory waiting periods, having to come back in 3 days' time. What does that mean? That means people have to take off from work. They have to get childcare. They have to get, access to travel funds and resources. And we're also still asking them to travel during COVID. So it really is incredibly cruel. We had another patient who traveled hundreds of miles to Colorado, but she didn't want to put any of her family members at risk because she didn't know how to interpret the new law. So she drove by herself. It's the isolation, it's the stigma, it is that emotional barrier that we are looking at. And I think really understanding who is most harmed by these restrictions, right? These are going to be the people who had, likely the least resources in the first place. Communities of color, LGBTQ communities, folks who've already faced significant discrimination and other barriers to healthcare that we've just seen laid bare over the last couple of years. So it's hard to put in words just how incredibly emotional it's been. And I think about the providers all the time who have taken these vows to provide care no matter what, who have to deny their own impulses to provide that care, and really the trauma that they are experiencing as well.
Well, Alexis, we've been honored to have some of the previous leaders from Planned Parenthood on the show as well. And they've made the point over and over that reproductive health is women's health, and that the health of women is being compromised in a myriad of ways by these actions. And certainly, really all across the country, Planned Parenthood's been an essential healthcare provider for decades, for as long as we've been engaged in healthcare. And it would seem that there's a real deterrent effect for women being able to access even the non-abortion services, but the health services, the routine birth control, the help with spacing families, the health screenings that Planned Parenthood has done such an effective job of. What are you seeing in terms of the sort of the spillover effect of the focus on the abortion laws in terms of just being a deterrent to people getting the primary health care, GYN care, family planning care that they've come to count on Planned Parenthood for?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, this from just seeing what's happened during the pandemic, the number of folks who have just delayed getting care because they haven't wanted to come out, or they haven't had access to the telehealth care and our other ways of providing access to information and education. So, we were all kind of in a prolonged period of needing more care than ever. And Planned Parenthood is a critical part of that public health infrastructure. Every year, millions of people of all identities come to Planned Parenthood for abortion and birth control, STI testing and treatments, gender affirming care, all of these services that I think, we in this moment have become critically important as people are being very intentional and deliberate in how they are organizing their lives. And so it is important, right, that our doors stay open. It is important that we continue to expand access to care, access to rural care in places where we may be the first point of entry into the healthcare system. So my biggest fear around some of these horrific bans and laws is the impact on our ability to continue to provide the broad spectrum of healthcare that we do, because we know that in this time it's ever more critical, and that ensuring that people have access to the full spectrum of sexual and reproductive health care, and that they have the full spectrum of, quite frankly, I think the agency that comes with being able to, control and determine your future is such a critical part of what we also provide. And so we are definitely concerned and are just fighting as hard as we can to make sure that our doors will stay open no matter what.
It's an important fight. We're speaking today with Alexis McGill Johnson, President and CEO of Planned Parenthood Federation of America and Planned Parenthood Action Fund. Alexis, since the 2016 election, we've watched a surge of activism and protest against assaults on rights, whether it's women's health, voting rights, civil rights. And You run Planned Parenthood's Action Fund and have really a strong background, personal background in political activism. Aside from providing advocacy for patients and for women's health, what's the prescription or the collective action you're calling for?
Yes, I was raised from the cradle to the to the march right now, to believe in securing rights for everyone, that none of us will be free until we're all free, right? That was a kind of standard remarks at my kitchen table. But I think what's become even more apparent and true in the last year and a half or so is that the intersection of all of our movements are fighting for the same freedoms, right? The freedoms around our bodies, our rights, our ability to not just survive, but to thrive. And what we have seen is that the intersection of so many issues around abortion rights, around racial justice, around our ability to participate in democracy, that these things are inextricably linked. Our patients come to us, perhaps, as I said, for an STI screening or access to family planning or abortion. But when they leave, they don't just carry that identity with them, right? The fact that they came for a medical procedure, they leave and they may face, a police officer stopping their car, like one of our patients who was denied an abortion in Texas and had to drive to Oklahoma for care. We talked about this in our amicus brief that we filed with the Supreme Court. On her way there, she and her boyfriend, who are Black, they were pulled over by the police and questioned about where they were going and why they were going, and they were scared. And so I think it is our responsibility to stand with our patients and the many experiences that they are having to demonstrate that this movement for freedom has to recognize the ways in which our identities and our identities intersect, and fight for the policies that will continue to protect them in the same way that their healthcare will.
Well, Alexia, I'm going to maybe try and inject a little bit of good news in some of this, and that is that the Biden administration has revoked a Trump-era ruling that barred health clinics receiving Title X funding, which I think of as family planning funding generically, from offering patients information on how to end a pregnancy. I wonder if you'd share with our listeners how that so-called abortion gag rule impacts access to full reproductive health for our patients, and what do you think we'll see once the Biden reversal goes into effect on November 8th? It's hard to build something up after you've kind of taken it down. Be curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that it is tremendous to have a partner in the White House and throughout the administration that truly understands the importance of basic family planning, healthcare, why it plays such a critical role in our communities. Health education, the ability to provide people with the full scope of sexual and reproductive healthcare services, like that is essentially what was being denied under the Title X gag rule that had been in place for 2 years by the Trump administration. Prior to 2019, every year Planned Parenthood health centers served about 40% of the 4 million patients that rely on Title X. It was harmful to have the gag rule. It was deeply unpopular. It really, again, going back to my point about providers in SB8, it was asking providers to provide substandard care. It was asking providers to withhold information to patients on all of the options available to them. It slashed provider capacity in half and created more barriers to affordable health care. So our ability, I think, in this moment, we're grateful in our network that a number of states stepped in and backfilled resources to Title X. In a moment when, we were also facing significant, concerns around the pandemic. So the infrastructure is still there, and the work that the Biden administration is doing to also build in kind of equity metrics to hold us all accountable, to ensure that we are making sure that the very patients that we are seeing, we're seeing them in the most equitable way, and hopefully in the same vein, building Title X back better, right? Modernizing it, thinking about the variety of patients it should be seeing and the number of services that should be included in sexual and reproductive health care. So I'm hopeful. I really appreciate that bright spot because it has been a dark month for sure. But it is great to have partners who are really understanding how critical expanding access to healthcare broadly is going to be for this country.
Great. Alexis, as we talked about at the top of the show, the Supreme Court has signaled twice now that it's unlikely to move in any meaningful way towards protecting Roe v. Wade, at least in its current configuration. And we know that Justice Kagan and Sotomayor have spoken out harshly against the overt reluctance of the High Court to step in and protect women's constitutional right. And there's been talk about expanding the number of justices on the Supreme Court. I'm wondering what position you all have taken and what you expect may happen.
Look, it's a great question. We are certainly planning for every scenario, win-loss, and in between. But as you know, we can't read the tea leaves. But as you indicated, there is a lot to be concerned about. It is a particularly grave time for abortion rights, and there is no question that Roe is hanging on by a thread. It has also been meaningless in many states for a long time. It is, as our reproductive justice colleagues say, Roe was always the floor. I think what we are seeing in response to, particularly to SB 8 in Texas, and the idea that the court is taking up Mississippi in such a way that goes to the essence of Roe, whether or not we get to make decisions pre-viability versus the state lawmakers. It means that people are, waking up to the idea that Roe could no longer exist after half a century. And as you said just before, it's hard when you take a right away that has existed for a really long time. People are going to fight back. You already feel the energy and the hurt. So we're preparing. We're working with our partners to do whatever comes next. What is true is that there is literally no state in the union where banning access to abortion, getting rid of Roe, is popular. What we have right now are a number of states, 26 states in particular, that have essentially a vocal minority of lawmakers who are creating laws that go against the will of the people. And I have to believe that when these protections, these federal protections, are potentially gone under Roe, that people will be pushing for proactive legislation to protect abortion, fighting, ensuring their lawmakers have respect for our health and rights. It means that we have to continue doing the work of abortion stigma, right? Reducing the stigma to make sure that people understand it as the common essential health procedure that it is, and making sure that, people are connecting the dots between what they expect to be protected on in terms of their constitutional rights, that they understand how they have been consistently undermined, not just by their lawmakers, but also by the courts that are intended to be there to protect them as well.
Well, thank you so much for that. And maybe I could just get another question in here. We'd like to think that policy would follow the evidence, right? And where there's good evidence for something, we'd see replication. And one of those that was really very impressive to me was the experience in Colorado of making contraception, particularly long-acting reversible contraception, basically available free of charge to young women, particularly who would face, not just young women, but women who would face barriers getting that kind of contraception. And the outcome was a very sharp decline in the number of abortions, a sharp decline, as I understand it, also in the number of teen pregnancies, and even on outcome measures like admissions to newborn intensive care units. When we see that kind of positive intervention, one would think that would gain support and we would see that roll out across the country. But are you following that? And what are you seeing in terms of states basically investing, maybe a little more upstream around trying to make effective and safe contraception much more readily available to people, regardless of their economic means?
Absolutely. Look, I mean, I think that, and I think that's why, we're thrilled by the Biden administration around Title X to make sure it's also equitable, right? And that people are getting significant access to and expanding access to contraception. This is going to be a really critical part of how we are navigating in particularly in a potentially post-Roe era. And we also know that contraception is not 100% foolproof. And so, it does mean that we will need to continue to fight for access to abortion. But Colorado is a terrific example. LA County is a wonderful example. We've opened 50 well-being centers in high schools where, students are able to leave algebra and geometry class and walk down the hall and talk to a nurse practitioner about the choices that they want to make with respect to their bodies, ask for counseling around contraception, and then go back without losing a moment's way from their desks. There's a community health centers that are also serving the community, so the parents are able to come in and ask their own questions for themselves in after school when the kids are home from dinner. And so I think there are so many models out there that are both advancing from a medical standards and guidelines practices, but also that what is best for community. And I think that those are the things that is going to be the responsibility for states that have the capacity to expand access to healthcare in this way, particularly sexual and reproductive healthcare. Their biggest job right now, in addition to seeing the patients that may come to them from the South and the Midwest because of these bans, they have to be exporting that imagination back into the states that people are leaving, because we have to give people a vision of what is possible so that they will stand with us and fight for what they know they should have.
Alexis, thinking about women's reproductive rights, it's not only a national issue, it's a global issue. And I'm wondering, what's the landscape look like for abortion rights as you look around the globe? Is there anything that you're hopeful for or concerned about?
Oh, thank you for this question, Mark. Yes, but I'm reminded Planned Parenthood has a global arm to it, right? We have a Planned Parenthood global work. And we just finished listening to a number of our leaders across the country. I mean, we're seeing La Marea Verde in Argentina, Mexico has reverse policies, to the north of us in Canada, we have a prime minister who has empowered a minister focused solely on implementing a feminist policy framework in their work. So, from Ireland to Argentina, the work that is happening to really shift norms, in some ways, they are going forward leaps and bounds while we are retracting. So we have so much to learn, I think, from our colleagues abroad about changes in healthcare delivery, which we know is going to shift as the impact on the number of health centers, both during with the pandemic or with some of these restrictions, how we modernize our healthcare delivery and ensure that we can get to people that most need access, and also how we continue to strengthen and build our movements to fight and show up in the plazas and make sure that we are all there and linked globally. And I think that's our work right now. Our tagline with our Planned Parenthood Global is, how do we continue to back the brave? And I think about that all the time, because that is the work that we are doing right here, right now, backing the brave as part of the globe that the U.S. is, making sure that the people who are trying to take our rights away are no match for the people who are going to continue to defend and do everything they can to maintain them.
We've been speaking today with Alexis McGill Johnson, President and CEO of the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. You can learn more about their comprehensive healthcare services and their advocacy work by going to plannedparenthood.org or follow them on Twitter at PPFA. Alexis, we want to thank you for your tenacity in the fight for women's reproductive health over a lifetime, for your activism, your advocacy for health equity, and thank you so much for joining us today on Conversations on Healthcare.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's been wonderful.